good evening, and welcome to Environmental Studies Rewilding Planet Earth series. This is a lecture series that's funded with a grant from the Institute for Liberal Arts. And my name is Tara Pisani-Garreau. I'm the director of the Environmental Studies program, and I'm an associate professor of the practice in Earth Environmental Sciences. This series was created by an interdisciplinary group of faculty on campus to engage the Boston College community and our communities beyond in the twin crises of biodiversity loss and global climate change. Just some quick housekeeping before we begin. Tonight's presentation will go until about 8 p.m. and that will include time for questions and answers. And then right after the talk, there'll be a book signing with a selection of Frances Moore Lappé's books that are available for purchase from the BC bookstore set outside this room. So I'm sure many of you have been following the news on biodiversity loss. The stats are really sobering. According to a recent UN report, 1 million of the world's 8 million plant and animal species that have been identified are at risk for extinction, many within this century. The main cause of the extinction crisis is habitat loss, due in large part to our global food system that prizes quantity over quality. Climate change further degrades and reduces habitat for many species, and it turns out that we too need healthy ecosystems, intact ones, more than ever to buffer against the impacts of present and future climate change. But it's not too late to turn things around. We can ambitiously protect wild lands and marine ecosystems and actively restore degraded ecosystems to create a nature-positive future. This is our moral responsibility over the next several decades, and to get there, we need to reimagine our relationship with nature, with food, and with our now 8 billion brothers and sisters around the world. Which brings us to the focus of tonight's event. So introducing tonight's speaker is Professor Juliet Schor, a professor of sociology at Boston College. Professor Schor's research focuses on consumer culture, time use, environmental sustainability, and the new sharing economy. Some of her books include The Overworked American, The Overspent American, Sustainable Lifestyles and the Quest for Plenitude, and True Wealth. Schor's 2022 TED Talk, The Case for a 4-Day Work Week, which we assigned to in our class, has already been viewed nearly 2 million times. She co-teaches the very popular core course Planet in Peril, which will be offered in the spring semester. Julie, thank you for joining this evening.
Thank you. Well, this is such a pleasure to be here and to introduce Frances Moore Lappé. I'm doing this from my phone because my printer didn't work, and if this is okay, it's going to be a permanent thing. So I almost never print anything out. Let's see how this goes. So Lappé is a national treasure who has changed the world. You probably know her best for her path-breaking work on food and agriculture. As the New York Times said in 2019, Frances Moore Lappé changed how we eat. Toiling away as a graduate student in the library at UC Berkeley, Frances discovered that the problem of hunger, which was a pressing social issue in the 1960s due to very rapid population growth, was not caused by inadequate food supply. Lappé worked out that there was adequate capacity to feed the entire world if only we shifted how we produced by going to plant-based diets rather than inefficient meat production. How ahead of her time was she on that? It's, the buzzword of 2022 is probably plant-based diet. Lappé went on to write Diet for a Small Planet, which has sold more than 3 million copies, and which she just released in its 50th anniversary edition last year. The Smithsonian's National Museum of American History describes the book as, quote, one of the most influential political tracts of our times. Diet for a Small Planet is a brilliant book for many reasons. It challenges wisdom that was not only conventional, but was absolutely dogma. Hunger must be due to not enough food. Population growth must be putting pressure on food supplies. Lappé showed that we could eat differently and not only feed everyone, but become far healthier in the process. But the New York Times said more than that Lappé changed how we eat. And here's the next line. She wants to do the same for our democracy. Lappé has written numerous books on how to revitalize democracy in America, revealing her uncanny ability to choose to work on the most urgent issues of our time, well ahead of the rest of us catching up to them. And of course, her work reveals the deep connections between democracy and food, and that if we want a sustainable, equitable, and healthy food system, we cannot continue with corporate-dominated economic system, concentrated ownership, and chemically driven agriculture. Frances is not only a researcher and writer, she is an extremely successful advocate and activist. In the mid-1970s, she co-founded the Institute for Food and Development Policy, which you may know as Food First. This organization, which became a hugely influential voice on global food justice, fighting the international finance and trade institutions, the World Bank, the WTO, the IMF, which enforce a system that routinely produces hunger, starvation, and inequity. More recently, she founded with her daughter Anna Lappé the Small Planet Institute, which you can see here, which is just across the river in Cambridge. Lappé has written 20 books, and she is just, I think, just one short of honorary degrees to match every book, 19, incredible. And she's also received some of the most important awards that our world gives. The James Beard Humanitarian of the Year Award, the Rachel Carson Award, the Right Livelihood Award, which is also known as the Alternative Nobel, and many others. I'm gonna end with a few personal notes. Frankie probably doesn't know this, or it's possible I told her at some point, but in high school, I read Gandhi's autobiography and became a vegetarian. At that time, I had no idea how to eat without meat, and after a fairly short period of time, to the great relief of my mother, I went back to being a carnivore. Just after a couple of years, I went to college, 1972, and of course I read Diet for a Small Planet, everyone was. And this time, thanks to Frankie, I was able to make it stick, and I've been a vegetarian with a very short exception of time since then. So she really inspired me, actually more than Gandhi was able to. I had the privilege of meeting Frankie a few years later when I was a graduate student. She probably doesn't remember this. And she had recently started her work on deep democracy, a very prescient work. So we're talking 1970s, or mid-1970s. I have a wonderful memory of dinner at my advisor's house, Sam Bowles, who introduced me. And I was, I was pretty young. I remember being so impressed that someone who was a world famous expert on food and agriculture, when I met her, she was working on democracy, a completely different topic, and that just kind of really stunned and very much impressed me. As well as the fact that she was doing more than just researching and writing, she was also starting a new organization on democracy. Another episode of inspiration came in 2001, my first year at Boston College, when she and her daughter, Anna Lappé, published a book based on traveling the world to see how people were reinventing agriculture and food practices to make them healthy, equitable, and sustainable. The name of the book is Hope's Edge. It's a fantastic book. I've taught it in my classes. But it's a powerful and inspirational testament to the possibility of change. And even though it came out about 20 years ago, it's still very, very relevant, and I highly recommend it. That year, I pledged to myself that I would also write a book with my daughter. I haven't gotten there yet, but the two of them did meet and become friendly. But thanks to Frankie, I know I will. Please join me in welcoming Frances Moore Lappé.
Thank you so very, very much. Now, you can hear me if I'm here, right? This is our plan. I am so happy to see you here. Thank you for coming. And I want to tell you that It was this very special night for me because when I first landed in Boston 2 decades ago, the very first college I spoke is here. So it feels like a reunion, and I'm just thrilled 2 decades later to return. And so I will pick up on my personal journey that Juliet's already described a bit of it. I will pick up right there. And who I was then, because it informs everything about my core themes tonight. Let's see, I can do this. There I am. Okay, there I am, right at that moment when I was trying to figure out my life direction. In 1968, fresh out of a Quaker college in the Midwest, I got my first job in the war on poverty. And I went door to door to door to door, helping people, the poorest women in Philadelphia, helping to organize. And I was paid by our government to do it, believe it or not. And in the midst of that year of community organizing, the woman that I worked most closely with, Lily, in her early 40s, died of a heart attack. And that was a real life changer for me because I didn't know how I could address the roots of the loss of my dear friend, because I knew she didn't die of a heart attack. She died of poverty. And I wasn't sure how I was going to get that deep. So I spent some time, here I'm pondering, and at some point, it hit me. Food. It's the most basic thing. If I could only understand why hunger in the world, that would unlock the mysteries of economics and politics, and I would find my way, right? That just made perfect sense to me. So here I am, and at that time, as Juliet already mentioned, there was a big scarcity scare. The book Population Bomb had exploded, a Stanford professor, and my friends were saying, oh, I can't have babies because that would be unethical. There's not enough for anyone. And so it was that time of real questioning, and I went to the library, put 2 and 2 together, and I found, no, there's more than enough for all of us. What is this? We are actually creating scarcity out of plenty. And I wanted to share that message. So I wrote a 1-page handout, and then I thought, I should know a little bit more. And it became a little booklet, and it got into the hands of the founders of paperback publishing. So some good luck in there, because I gotta tell you, all the students in the room, I made a C on my first English paper in college. So I never expected to be a writer. And but I believe if you care enough, you figure out the rest. And so, so my questions over these decades continued to grow, but ultimately they got to this question. Why are we together, we human beings, creating a world that not one of us would choose? Who gets up in the morning and says, yes, I want to make sure another child dies. Yes, I want to obliterate another species today. Why? I have never met anyone who does that. So why are we together creating a world that none of us as individuals would ever invent? And over time, I began to see that the answer for me is that we are creatures of the mind. Our big brains can big trouble. And that as creatures, it's wonderful to have these complex brains, but they mean that we see the world through an idea structure. They're very complex brains, and they come up with theories, and these frames, these filters, then determine what we can see and what we cannot see. So I like to say that, we hear the expression so often, seeing is believing, but I think for our species, it's something different. So, I did jump ahead, sorry. This is my big storm, that in a big storm, I love this slide because the theme here that I jumped over is that in a big storm, that it exposes the roots for the first time, and that we are in an enormous storm, whether we're talking about species decimation or the decline of democracy worldwide or climate chaos. We are in the midst of a big storm. And hey, just when we are in the storm, it's when we can see the roots. So that is what I wanted to communicate. And so then the root, one key root, is this idea that our big brains are creating these frames that determine what we can see and what we cannot see. And so what happens then is that instead of seeing it's believing, that it's really more accurate to say that believing is seeing. That how we construct the world allows us to see life-saving directions or those that are just taking us down, down, down. So what are, and I have to say that if you don't believe me, how about Albert Einstein? I'll pull in Albert. This is the same idea, right? It is theory which decides what we can observe. And so what are the big ideas, the big theories that we have to really rethink in order to save ourselves and save this beautiful, beautiful planet? So here is the deal. Most important in our belief system, I think, or at least right up there in the key important, whoops, sorry, I need water here. Yes. So key is who we believe ourselves to be, right? Who are we? That is really, really important. And in our culture, often what's communicated, what we absorb in the frame is that if you peel away the fluff, if you peel away, the pretense, what we can really count on is that we are selfish, materialistic, and competitive, right? That's really the sure thing. And what happens then with that sort of, belief system is that then we believe that these traits serve what? A market economy very, very well. We can really count on these impulses to then drive and produce ultimately for the benefit of all. Just rely on kind of the worst in us. And so we turn over our fate to a market logic, determining not only our species' fate, but what could be 9 million species of other plants and animals. So where does this market logic take us? To create exactly what we say we fear. This logic's premise calls back, I call a lack of goods and goodness, and it triggers this. It triggers what I call a spiral of powerlessness, because we start with this premise of lack, that we're essentially, I call it lack of goods and goodness. There's scarcity everywhere, and there's scarcity of goodness in us. If we start from that premise, so of course, we can't deliberate together for the common good. That's democracy. We can't do that. We can't really trust government, so we have to turn over our fates and determine the winners and losers by a free market. Now, what happens, of course, is that our market is driven by one rule. Do what brings highest return to existing wealth. So wealth returns to wealth, until those left behind then feel shame, and that foments blame, and look what happens. Concentrated economic power twists our political decisions, and so it reinforces this negative downward spiral, because then we see there, we really are just selfish little materialists. And that then is a spiral that I have felt in many ways intensifying in my life, in my lifetime. So here we have to then really go to the underlying roots of this crisis to break free of this downward spiral. And by that, I mean that we need to really examine the three interacting roots of this economic logic that creates this disaster. So what are those roots? I see three interacting roots. I'll start with your right side there, this brutal form of capitalism, I call it, that creates this humiliation and then blaming, that then corrupts our democracy and we end up then with an assault on nature that leads to fear and too much despair. So that cycle, or those interacting roots, I should say now, is really critical to untangle. So that's what I want to just spend a moment. That by economic, I mean this, yes, the brutal form of capitalism. And I just learned, can you believe this? 2,000 billionaires who could pretty much squeeze into the high school down the street from me, control as much wealth as 60% of the world's people. And in 2021, they increased their wealth by the trillions of dollars equal to the GDP of Japan. It's wild, okay, just in that year. So economic brutal form of capitalism is one of the roots. And the political root, I mean the corruption of democracy by big money. Now, just since '06, spending on federal elections in the United States by special interest has more than doubled to about $9 billion. And that's not even counting on the money spent on lobbyists. And I want to just throw in here that I compared that to how much, say, per person is spent in a German election. And I wish I had it in my head, but a tiny fraction of that money that is spent in driving our system. So that political root, and then the assault on nature is both a root and a consequences, because we then have, for example, the interaction with the economic and the assault on nature. I just learned, for example, that there are still the worst carbon polluters, you probably know, are coal-fired plants. And now there are still 458 of them that are the worst polluters, as I say, that are still being built around the world. And that is very telling to me. So these three roots then feed into each other, and economic and political roots generate desperate poverty, and to survive, those pushed aside have to also abuse the earth. For example, in the Amazon today, I think of I'm aware the Amazon, our largest rainforest, I'm aware of the big guys going in and make big bucks, but they're also just poor people, just cutting trees down because they can't survive otherwise. And so there is this interaction between then this intensification of poverty and the decimation of biodiversity. As market fundamentalism then spreads, democracy declines worldwide. Now, this is a worldwide trend of the corrupted democracy. Throughout the world, democracy is generally in decline. And I learned recently that the United States, which sees itself as such a magnificent leader in the world of democracy, we actually rank 62nd in the world between Panama and Samoa in the quality of our democracy. So all of this, I just wanted to just absorb the idea of how these roots interact. And of course, then people begin to distrust government and become more disengaged, although I was so happy to see young people voting and in our most recent election. So that is some of the background of what I'm trying to communicate tonight. So now, where are we? So then we, I move this talk more in the direction of the overall theme of the series. I'm painting a big picture, but it definitely connects with everything that you're focused on in this series, because I realized that I thought for the 3 C's, so I could remember the ecological destruction that's tied to what we consume, what we cut down, and what we chemically defile. And that is a really important piece to understand that is coming out of this brutal form of capitalism and this mindset that I've alluded to. So what happens then is that there is this three C's. The first C is the consumption embedded in staggeringly wasteful, destructive practices. Now, worldwide meat production uses almost 80% of the land. I think there's yes, there is a slide on that. Uses, this really sticks in my head. Can you imagine devoting 80% of our agricultural land to produce livestock that we get back? Really, I've read 18, not even 20, but we're up there in that category. I mean, the staggering inefficiency is really something. So, and the World Health Organization, by the way, and I, as the author of Diet for a Small Planet, was shocked. I didn't know this. I wanted to know if you knew this, that in 2015, the World Health Organization declared red meat a probable carcinogen. Did you know that? And processed meat a carcinogen. And yet, what do we feed our kids? Hot dogs and bologna and stuff. So not only is it incredible, staggeringly wasteful, but it is also a very bad choice for our health. And yet, that is what is produced out of this mindset and these interacting forces. So I'll return to the three C's again. So the second, of course, is what we cut down, the rapid deforestation. You know, I'm sure that the Amazon is the world's largest. Did you know that it is twice the size of India? That's pretty impressive. And so as what we cut down then is home to 3 million species, 1/3 of all the Earth's tropical trees. And logging was under President Bolsonaro at a horrific rate. And now that Lula da Silva has been elected again, in the past when he was elected, the cutting of the rainforest greatly reduced, and now we can hope that there will be less of the felling of the rainforest with that more democratic president. And so I'm very encouraged about that. And then the third piece is what we chemically defile. There's just been a major study that found that pesticides are the reason why 40% of all insect species face extinction. And so that is pretty terrifying. And so I want to move to this wonderful quote. It is far too late and things are far too bad for pessimism, right? And so I want to lift us up in talking about then another way of seeing the challenge, that we can find our place in turning the corner toward life. So I want to start with, yes, of course we can be those three awful characteristics of selfish, materialistic, and competitive. Yet, human beings are perhaps the most cooperative and empathetic species. I love the work of Michael Tomasello, brilliant. He's at Duke now, I think, but he wrote the book, Why We Cooperate, and he talks specifically about the unique human capacity for shared intentionality, that our species can come together in group intention and planning in that sense. And that's one of the things that distinguishes us. But we have a deep capacity and need for fairness. I mean, if any of you have little brothers and sisters or little kids in your house, it's not fair, Mommy, you hear that, right? Well, it's not just our species. I love this experiment where there were capuchin monkeys in some kind of setting, experimental setting, and they could see each other. They were in cages, and the caretaker gave a really sweet treat, like, maybe grapes or something cool, to one set of monkeys. I think they were capuchin. And the other got something very, very, ordinary. And guess what? The ones who looked over and saw the better treats, they actually threw their rations to the caretaker, like saying, no, I'm not going to eat that if he gets this. So this deep sense of being treated fairly is in all of us. And then studies also show that we get greater pleasure from giving than receiving. And I think, we can feel, as the holidays come up, we know that's true. It's so fun when we give and we see the enjoyment of another person. So the work of Michael Tomasello is really important in this regard. And so I also want to encourage us, yes, we have these capacities, we have this, and we also have very deep needs beyond the physical that we can count on. And by power, I mean the Latin root of power is simply to be able. I don't need power over. We need a sense of agency. We can count on that we need to know our lives matter, right? And that's very close then to we need meaning and connection. So power, meaning, and connection in our lives is really my definition of human dignity. That's what we all need, and of course can only happen in a democracy. I will come to that. And here it is then, that these essential human needs are met only with these conditions that to me define democracy. What I mean is the dispersion of power, of course, because we know autocrats are answering only to their worst instinct. So the wide dispersion of power and transparency. We all know that we do better when someone's watching. And I love this experiment that was done in a university in the UK, where a psychology professor put a picture of human eyes over the coffee station because the other professors weren't paying for their coffee. And he just put a picture of human eyes, and suddenly a lot more of the professors coughed up the change they needed to contribute to the cause for their coffee. So we all do better when we know somebody may be watching. And then what I call mutual accountability. And I want to make clear what I mean by that. Because yes, we have to hold each other accountable. Yes, we do. But we have to solve the problems and to create the kinds of democracy that will address these deep breakdowns in our systems. We need to get away from the blame game. And so by mutual accountability, I love the saying of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said, some are guilty, but all are responsible. And so, I used to get so angry at those bankers who put us into a downward spiral in 2008. And they knew what they were doing. In fact, one of the slogans in these Wall Street bankers right before the big crash, their slogan was, IBG, YBG, I'll be gone, you'll be gone. They knew they would get out with their millions and the rest of us would go broke, right? So transparency is so key in the kind of human behavior that we all want to exhibit. And finally, this theme of mutual accountability, both of those. And so I'd like to say, yes, we can point fingers, but it's always got to come all the way around and include ourselves. What could we have done better to prevent the problem? So this is really the key for me, is that we know what conditions bring out the best in us and define democracy. And what we need, I think, I'm just going to start telling some stories now, and none of these big ideas and more than stories, but to really believe that we can create these social conditions, meeting these deepest human needs beyond the physical, what I call living democracy, that we need inspiration from those often in the most unlikely places who are actually living out what I'm talking about. So I just want to share with you a few stories that I've had personal contact with and that have changed my life. And so here is, sorry. These traits and all that I said before lead to a spiral of empowerment, and the opposite of the spiral of powerlessness. So I think you get the idea that then as we evolve and we create the rules that bring out those better qualities, and we can remove power from its grip over democracy, then that sets in motion the opposite dynamic from what I presented earlier. So that is super, super critical. Now, let me keep going here. The story part. Here is the Green Belt movement that my daughter and I, Juliet was kind enough to mention our book Hope's Edge that we wrote together in the year 2000. We traveled. Our first trip, I think, was to visit Kenya and to meet the Kenyan women who ultimately have planted 51 million trees in villages all across, because when Wangari Maathai was awakening to the destruction of the forest in Kenya and said, we village women, we can do something, we can act. And so I got to get in on the act myself there and plant a tree. And so Wangari then ultimately wins the Nobel Peace Prize for her work. And it was all that, in the community, women working together, planting trees, 51 million trees. And I was very, very touched by that. But also I had the experience of traveling in Brazil. Now we know of the terrible destruction of the rainforest going on, but very few of us hear about the landless workers movement. Now I just want to note that in Brazil, 3% of the landowners own almost over half of farmable land in that country. And in the mid-1980s, the landless workers movement formed to risk lives, to go onto this unused land that was owned by the 3% and to just settle on it and to start farming it. That really took guts. Now there was a provision or some comment, I forget the exact wording, but in the Brazilian Constitution that said that the land was to be used for a social purpose, and so they felt they had, the moral backing of their own constitution. But they risked their lives to create this incredible movement that created cooperative settlements that were growing food sustainably, and were now contributing somewhat to the reforestation challenge in their country. And today they have 1.5 million members that are settled on 19 million acres of land. And so this is an extraordinary movement that I think very few in this country recognize, and that is happening, I'm sure, in other countries that I'm not aware of. But I want to jump in the storytelling here to India, because I got to visit women of the Deccan Development Society a number of years ago, and I got to sit with them and really talk to them. And they explained to me that 30 years prior, that there was hunger for everyone in their village, and they had no power. They had no power with the husbands, no power with the village leaders, nothing. And everybody was hungry. They underlined that. And now they said with such pride, there is no hunger in our community. And it started by the women meeting after their kids were in bed at night. They would meet in each other's homes, and they would just put together whatever little tiny bits of money they had, put it together until they could give one woman a chance to buy a little land so she could start growing other things than just white rice for the landlord. And it grew and grew and grew until they were able to take me out into a field of 21 different crops. They were all healthy crops in their fields, and now their millet, which is much better for us than white rice, is being used in the local schools. Now they have their own radio station so they can spread the word about what they're doing. The Deccan Development Society moved into 75 villages. And the latest thing is wild greens, which I thought was really interesting. That's just in the last year or so. And so we speak of biological diversity. I found that really cool. But the moment that I most remember about my visit is as I was walking out, I heard this rustle behind me. And of course I turned around, and the women were racing up to me. And they said, oh, we forgot to tell you the most important thing. We forgot to tell you. And I stopped. What we forgot to tell you is that we found our courage. And that will stay with me forever. And I'm going to return to that theme in a moment. The Deccan Development Society is some real lesson for all of us about possibility. And also I've been following the development of agroforestry. Are many of you aware of that term, agroforestry? Because I think a lot of, especially Americans, especially if you're in the Midwest, you think that trees and crops, no, they don't go together. They ruin each other. The trees would shade the crops and blah. Well, actually, no. That agroforestry is an ancient approach that was, especially in the country of Niger, I've been following because it was once controlled by the French colonists who cut down all the trees for some strange reason. But as a result of that, in Niger, there were all these tree stumps that that nobody had thought could possibly add to the richness of their diet. But then they learned about agroforestry, the idea of mixing trees and crops. And now it made a huge difference from taking millions of people out of hunger in Niger, for example. And I was able to talk to somebody at the Geological Survey, and he estimates that now in sub-Saharan Africa, 500,000 square miles, that's twice the size of Texas, is in agroforestry, and yet most of us never even know this. And I loved it when I was writing Diet for a Small Planet. I asked him, well, what's a conversation I might include to give the taste of this? And he said, so I heard this story from a little boy who said, we have trees in our fields, and so now if mommy and daddy, if they don't have lunch for me, I just go out and grab some fruit and I'm fine. So it was that sense of the possibility opened and also of course the leaves of the trees provide fodder and provide fertilizer for the crops, and so it's a win-win-win kind of approach to farming that most of us still are just beginning to learn about. So, and then I follow the work of a professor in the UK who set it upon himself to create a network studying the growth or tracking the growth of sustainable farming communities, ecological farming communities all over the world. And as of the year 2000, there were about 500,000 that he could track. And then from 2000 to 2020, check this out, that from those 2 decades, there were 8 million new self-organizing sustainable farming and forest communities emerging. And I just love this because it's over, I think he says 55 countries, yes. And it shows that this is not just it's great to have a Wangari Maathai who is inspiring people, but that this is spontaneously happening all over the world at a much quickened pace. So I really, really am inspired by all that I have shared with you. Now, here is where I stand. That I think optimism is very tough right now. But in a world of continuous change, when everything is connected, it is not possible to know what's possible. And that's what keeps me going. So I don't call myself an optimist. I call myself a possibilist. That it is possible, remember that image of the roots showing in this big, big storm, that people will awaken and find that sense of meaning, power, connection in healing our planet. So I am a possibilist. And what this means for me then is that right here, right now, possibilism does require one element. And that is that the element of courage. And courage to me is doing what we thought we could not do. And so I think, how can I believe the world can change if I don't experience myself changing? And I think personally, I think there's only one way to really change ourselves, to do what we thought we could not do. And so I've gotten a lot of help in this. And again, back to Wangari Maathai, when we were there, Anna and I, my daughter, she introduced us to a gentleman, Reverend Timothy Njoya, who had been threatened by the dictator at the time in Kenya that if he preached against the regime again, he would be killed. And the assailants came to his house. And ultimately, he didn't respond with fear. He greeted them and he was kind to them. And they couldn't kill him because they said, "You're a good person. You're not who we thought you were." And Anna and I said, "What? But fear, how could you possibly greet your assailants with this spirit?" And he says to us, "Well, think about it. Fear is just pure energy that we can use as we choose." And he got up and he acted out this little scene. He said, a lion doesn't just go like that to a prey. It just harmonizes its energy and then decides what to do. We have that same capacity. And so from that idea that fear is pure energy instead of something that's a stop sign, hey, it's energy we can take to do what we thought we could not do. And so I have a little trick I use personally. I used it once when I was really terrified of raising this is silly, I know, but well, maybe you will all relate, but I was gonna raise my hand in a lecture by Al Gore and challenge something he said, and all my friends were sitting there like bowing before him, and I was challenging. My heart was going, bum, 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 bum. And I said, oh, that's just my inner applause going off. So my pounding heart of fear, of rejection, and making a fool of myself, I decided it was my inner applause. And that's really served me very, very well. And I didn't get called on, though, unfortunately. But I did get my hand up. So and this key then is that as I wrap up here, that I really want to emphasize this theme of possibility, and that this theme then of courage to do what we thought we could not do. And I want to bring it back then to the possibilities for our own democracy. As I say, we rank now 62nd in the world. And all of the things that, these big picture things about the incredible wastefulness of our diet and the destruction of the rainforest and on and on and on, and the great concentration of wealth, fundamentally, it can only be challenged and changed and made life-serving as we create true, what I call living democracy. And so one of the things that I have turned to is this theme of to do this democracy work that has to be done, then it definitely means that we have to do that which makes us a little uncomfortable. And so I love then to rely on the words of Eleanor Roosevelt, who, by the way, was one of the founders of Freedom House, who now does these democracy scores. So she lives in this legacy. But I just love that do one thing every day that scares you. And then this other courage is more exhilarating than fear, and in the long run, it is easier. So go for that. You got to go for Eleanor's advice, I believe. So I really do believe that we can take this advice to heart and our social nature to heart, and learn that choosing our friends well is really part of the challenge. Choose your friends who are going to encourage you to stretch yourself, not just make you comfortable. Hang out with people who are doing the edgier things, and we will become more edgy ourselves. And so I think really that it is a very, very exciting time to be alive. That we know that every act we take, that someone is watching, someone is affected, and the ripples we will we will maybe never know that that life, that way of living is thrilling. And so, I want to end now then with, do you remember who gave the final poem at the Biden inaugural? The young woman, here she is. The new dawn balloons as we free it, for there is always light if only we are brave enough to see it, if we're only brave enough to be it. So I try to take Amanda's brilliant poem to heart, and I'd like to leave that up for our question and answer period. And thank you so much for letting me share my journey with you. And thank you.
Francis. And so we have 2 microphones, and we're gonna walk around and bring it to you so you can ask a question and confront any fear you might have about asking that question.
And remember the pounding heart. There you go.
Hello, my name is Luke. I'm a reporter for The Gavel, which is a student-run progressive newspaper here at BC. I liked what you said about not optimism, but possibilism in your talk. And I just wanted to ask, because this is something that always intrigues me, you seem to be very knowledgeable about environmental science, specifically on saving the planet. What are your thoughts on carbon capture technology? Do you think it's viable, if it'll help?
Well, I certainly don't think I'm an authority, and I haven't studied it and taken a position. I just know that all the things that I'm talking about here are all things we know we can do, we know we can make a difference, and we can know that we can do that now and expand it now and do it in a dispersed way where everyone can participate and not concentrate power more in the hands of those who have that scheme. But I don't really know enough to say too much more than that. I just like to focus on really what's right at us, right here, right now, that we know, and that we know we can spread and make a huge difference.
Okay, thank you.
Francis, can I add to that? Your question, Luke, got me thinking a little bit about it. And when Francis was showing the agroforestry slide, that and talking about food security and the complementarity between trees and crops, that's adding carbon right into that place. And that's really exciting. That's sort of the other piece of ecosystem restoration, is that's also storing carbon. Probably not enough to draw down our emissions, it won't offset what we emit with fossil fuel combustion, but it's certainly part of the solution.
Thank you.
Other questions? We have a nice little pocket back here, so I'll just come approach. And if you can tell us your name.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Skylar. I'm a freshman here. And I was just curious, what were you going to challenge Al Gore about when you were seeing him speak?
I was really pissed off that he did not name the power of private wealth and lobbyists in the crisis. And I just wanted to say, yeah, all this is great. But at that time anyway, maybe he did later, but to me he left out such a key element of why we got here and what we have to do to change it. Because as long as the fossil fuel industry is doing what it's doing and is still, like the Quaker College I go to, is still is still invested in fossil fuels, as long as we are allowing that to happen, then come on already, you've gotta name that, you've gotta name it. And he wasn't, at least in that speech, and now of course I wish I had.
Thank you.
I saw a question down here.
Hi, I'm Charlie. I was just wondering, because I want to get on board with all this stuff. Like, what is something that I, as a college student who lives in a dorm, can do?
Well, I think in college, if I had just found my questions earlier, there was one course I took in history of science that was the beginning of this idea that we see the world through these frames and not as it is, but as we are kind of thing. But I wish I'd found my questions earlier. So if I could do college again, I would say, okay, whatever course I'm taking, what are my questions that I want to answer in this course? And of course it may evolve, and hopefully it will and everything, but I kind of was too passive in that regard. I was too deferential maybe, but I think finding what's question, and it took me a few more years, but that time could have been used much better if I'd had my questions. Is that helpful?
Oh, I mean, you have one here too.
Okay. Melissa?
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Oh boy, it's so exciting. I'm Evan. I'm a master's student here studying education, and we talk a lot about in education classes how power structures are very reproductive, and you talked a little bit about defending and kind of growing democracy. And when you talk to people about defending democracy, one of the things that they tell you to do the most is to go out and vote. And voting definitely helps, but sometimes it feels like we're just reproducing those structures and putting the same people back in power who are kind of making the choices that we're trying to get away from. So how would you say that we can defend democracy moving beyond just voting?
Well, voting is certainly, yeah. Let me just suggest that we are co-creators. We at Small Plans Institute are co-creators of a tool called democracymovement.us. And it rose out of a march that I participated in 2016, where we walked from Philadelphia and sat on to the Capitol and sat in for what became the For the People Act, ultimately. And For the People Act is really the embodiment of the cluster of democracy reforms that could really make a difference. And John Sarbanes, for example, is one of my heroes in developing it. And so on this site, democracymovement.us, you can explore, you can go to your whatever state you're in and see what reforms are working there, but they fall under three categories. Yes, fair, voting rights, including ranked choice voting. It just happened in Seattle, I learned. That gives us, so we don't have the spoiler effect anymore, for one thing. And the possibility of public financing, which, by the way, Maine public financing has allowed a new college grad from Harvard, who I adore, Chloe Maxman, to become a legislator, and now she's a senator, and has taken on environmental issues and labor issues by being just this, because they had clean elections, meaning the public funding. She had to get $50 she had to get $5 from 50 people to, I believe that was it, something like that, to show this is a legitimate candidate. And then she qualified for public financing. Maine, Connecticut are exemplars of this. And most of the legislators now have been elected, the majority have been elected with, using public financing instead of being beholden to private dollars. So I think that going deeper, yes, public financing. Another key part of it is fighting gerrymandering. And there's a beautiful film about a woman named Katie Fahey, who just put a message on Facebook a few years ago saying, I'm really upset by the district lines that are so skewed in not really fair and giving people an equal voice. Is anyone else bothered? She was 23, I think. And she got so many responses that she went around in a van all over the state, had sessions in libraries all over the state, and got many more, 100,000, I think, more signatures for reforming the redistricting process. And so that it wouldn't be by insiders and by partisans, but the drawing of district lines in Michigan would be done by an independent commission. And her name is Katie Fahey. You can look her up, and it's a beautiful film made about her, and I'm just blanking on the title, but Katie Fahey. So that kind of energy, and these were people, whether it's Deb Simpson, the waitress at Auburn, Maine, who ran and became a stellar legislator in Maine, or Katie Fahey, they were just people who said, wait, or Chloe Maximum in Maine, young people who just said, I'm going to try it, I'm going to do it. And Chloe, in Maine, the one I was just referring to, who was a Harvard grad who wanted to go back to her hometown, and she said, how can I get a job? And she said, I could run for office. And I just read about her that she writes so many thank you notes to her constituents that she's got blisters on her hand. So she takes this incredibly personal approach, and I'm just going on about it because, you never, you try something new you've never tried, and you try it in a way that maybe is not the ordinary way of doing politics, like Chloe did this just very direct going. She said that she would walk down the path to people living in trailer parks, and they would say, nobody has ever knocked on my door and asked for my opinion before. So there are people, young people particularly, running for office and doing democracy very differently. And back to your question, that there are at least three big arenas. There's the voting rights, there's the redistricting, and then there is, my mind just went blank. Oh gosh, our website lays it all out, but money out of politics, effectively, yeah. So these arenas, and then you can see what's going on in your state. And out of that march then gave more energy and to this movement. And so now I think it's legitimate to call it a democracy movement, and that's why our website is democracymovement.us. So I hope that answered your question. And I often like to think, I love the phrase, the thrill of democracy. Democracy is not just a burden, to weight us down. What is more thrilling than finding one's voice? And that's what I discovered on that long march. I didn't think I could walk 10 miles, and I walked over 100. And I met people I never had met otherwise, and I felt so much less alone. And when I walked into Washington that day, I never knew this would happen to me. But as we approached the Capitol and I saw the dome for the first time, there was some internal thing that happened. And I said, oh, those people in those august buildings, they work for me. And so you never know when you step out of your comfort zone, which I was out of my comfort zone, that you can have these, it's kind of a simple realization, right? But it really changed me. And so I just encourage all of us to recognize the power of doing what we thought we could not do. And realizing that each thing like that will enable the next one to be easier, So, another question?
Well, I think we're out of time, and I want to respect that for people. But if you do have a question, Frances Moore Lappé will be right outside here signing books. You can come up and ask her a question. I just want to say thank you from all of us in college for sharing your wisdom, your experiences, and challenging us to really think outside of the box and put ourselves forward in the world to make these changes that we want to see.
I
So,
have time for a short poem.
yes, oh, sure.
Short poem from Denise Levertov. At
Yes.
least it's a good part of a beautiful poem. Beginners. We have only begun to love the earth. We have only begun to imagine the fullness of life. How can we tire of hope? So much is in bud. How can we tire of hope? We've only begun to know how it might be to live as sibling with beast and flower, no longer as oppressor. We've only begun to imagine the power that is ours if we would join our solitudes in a communion of struggle. So much is unfolding that must complete its gesture. So much is in bud. And so thank you for all that you're learning here and all of your courage to be here and ask the big questions. I honor you and thank you for inviting me. Thank you.